Wow, this past week kinda sucked. Pulled a back muscle, which is why I didn't set up the camera. Then the Binding of Isaac wouldn't record properly since it's the original Flash version, and it wasn't really responsive to Joy to Key. I would need to review the Rebirth remake, which I have on the PlayStation 4. But unfortunately, my PlayStation Plus subscription lapsed, so I don't have access to it. And when you're the type of reviewer that reviews whatever you want, when the version you have doesn't work right, it just screws up the schedule. Although kind of having a schedule when reviewing whatever you want kind of is contradictory. So I'm gonna review Fez, which I also got on PlayStation Plus, but also got it in a humble bundle, so I have it on PC. Fez has a little bit of a controversy behind it. The game was featured in a documentary Indie Game, the movie. Also in that movie they talked about Braid, Super Meat Boy, along with Fez. And Fez was in development hell for 5 years until it was released in 2012, being called the Duke Nukem Forever of indie games. And when it was released it received critical acclaim, but the real controversy is of the game's designer, Phil Fish, who is known for his very outspoken opinions and being kind of a douchebag. However, I think, and this may be controversial in itself, he's not entirely in the wrong. When you look at some of the horror stories you hear from game developers, it's understanding of why he's so standoffish. Game development is very stressful, and after being called a tosspot by a game critic, and that was obviously the straw that broke the camel's back, and he cancelled Fez too. After getting backlash, I think he was just trolling the gaming community before leaving it. Probably not meaning what he said, but just wanted to go out with a bang. Fez is an interesting game. It looks like it's from the 16-bit era. It's bright and colorful, and the music seems to be pushing the limits of what that era's hardware would be capable of. It's a good looking game and should bring in some feelings of nostalgia for those that grew up in the late 80s to mid 90s. Now while it looks like a 2D game, it's actually in 3D. When you get the Fez, you're able to shift perspective, allowing you to rotate the world, gaining access to new areas or making other areas easy to get to by closing gaps or moving faraway platforms closer to you. You'll also be using this mechanic to activate time switches, or use it to rotate platforms to form complete ladders out of pieces that are from other perspectives, which would be impossible otherwise to traverse. It's an innovative way to get from point A to point B. There's no enemies in the game, the intention being a stop and smell the roses type of game. However, there is fall damage. Fall too far and hit the ground and you'll die. But you'll just respawn from the last stable platform you were on before you fell, which makes no sense. I understand that if you fall into the abyss, you respawn, but hitting the ground from a really high spot doesn't. Making you go back the same way you came just adds unneeded length to the game, especially if a room ends in a dead end once you get to the top. There's a main hub for each area, which is marked by a large warp gate which will take you to the other main areas. Some rooms have a one-way warp gate that are meant to bring you to the one that you're closest to. However, if you're not done exploring one of the main subsections, then the trek back down to the door can be a little annoying since you can't jump back down to it. As you progress through the game, these black holes will appear, resulting in death if you touch them. Since there's no penalty for death, they're basically just a mild obstacle, and they tend to disappear if you go to a new area and come back later. So you'll be jumping and climbing about as you solve the game's various puzzles. Some of them are even QR codes that you'll need to scan with a smartphone to get the solution to. They're very clever puzzles once you figure them out. Some can only be solved during certain times of day, like the one in the observatory or the owl statue in the cemetery. Your overall goal is to collect 32 cubes of a big cube that shattered in the beginning of the game. You'll find some of those cubes at the end of certain rooms, but most of the time those cubes are broken up into smaller cubes, and you need to collect 8 of them to make a whole one. The game is very Metroidvania-like, so you'll be backtracking a lot in the game to get all the cubes, and then you may be looking up things through a guide just to solve that really hard puzzle, or just trying to figure out what you've missed. There's also blue cubes called anti-cubes, and there's 32 of them. They're not only harder to find, but the puzzle required to get them is also harder. And the nice thing is, anti-cubes count towards your total cubes, so when it comes to opening up doors that require a specific number, you'll be able to get in. There's also a lot of shortcuts that have the symbols of a square within a square. If you can figure out which one goes to where, it's easier to get from place to place. The game gives you no direction at all. There is the rare explanation on how to use something that's new, but once that's done, you're completely on your own. You do sometimes come into bits of lore of the world, but it's very vague. There's also a language that you can decipher when you find a tablet that says the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The little navvy thing that follows you around gives you some vague insight into the lore of the game as well, so it's up to you, the player, to put it all together. You can get about 50% of the game done in around an hour, but that in no means the game will be short. As the game stretches on and as you explore, it gets harder to find cube and cube bits. At 3 hours, I was at 85% completion with 22 cube shards, 5 anti-cubes, and 2 artifacts. At this point, I'm just backtracking trying to find everything I missed and solve the puzzles, which adds to the game's length. But once once you know where everything is and how to complete it, you can probably finish the game in a short amount of time. Fez is a pretty good game. It's a fun platformer with a great concept with challenging and innovative puzzles. And if you don't like Phil Fish and refuse to play this game, just let it go. Otherwise, you're depriving yourself of a good game for a pretty silly reason.